10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Welcome to part 6 of our video series highlighting the 1/100th scale Saturn V kit from Estes. In this video, we'll be installing the plastic corrugated detail wraps onto the forward airframe assembly. I would consider a viewing of the previous video covering wrap application onto the lower airframe a prerequisite to this, so go back and watch that installment if you haven't done so yet. We'll also be covering minor repairs to the wraps here, such as when the adhesive joint might weaken or fail. We'll start by trimming the adapter and third stage wraps. Now, clearly we can't use our traditional straight line methods to trim this. But what we can do is use a strip of 1/16 styrene stock. You may ask, well, James, where do I get that? Well, in my case, I go to the third drawer down on my workbench. In your particular case, you may just want to get the one package. What we're going to do is take the strip and bend it against the corrugations on our wrap. We're going to have to work in short sections here. Bend it up against the wrap. And then we'll use a pencil to mark a line. We'll move down a bit, mark another section. The same process also works on the inside curve. Next, we'll use a fresh blade to cut this out. Next, we can use a straight edge to do the ends. I should also mention, as one of the commenters on an earlier video pointed out, you can use a straight edge to guide a blade. My preference is to do it freehand, though. I'll use some sandpaper wrapped around a cork to refine some of the edges of the wrap. We'll also use a sanding stick to knock that edge off just a little bit. Let's discuss our third stage wrap. Now the idea here, and it's a great idea, is that this becomes a one-piece wrap that completely encapsulates the third stage in plastic, making it very easy to finish. There's one catch with that though. And instead of two seams hidden in the corrugations here and here, we now have this long seam that we also have to hide. I really don't want to have to do that. Now I confess I anticipated this. That's why we spent so much time priming and sanding this tube. Here's my plan. We're going to cut out the top and bottom corrugated sections of this wrap as separate components and apply them to the tube individually. We'll then use sheet styrene to scratch build these vertical cable raceway elements. Before we start cutting this up into pieces, we need to measure the cable raceways. Now, I'm not going to make you listen to me do measurements. That would not make for compelling video. Rest assured, we've got the measurements and we'll use them here in a bit. Let's start chopping our third stage wrap up into pieces. Let's trim the ends next. With that, the four sides of this wrap have been trimmed, and we can get an idea of how that would look if we went this way. I'd much rather clean up two short seams than one long one. Okay, now we're going to cut through the cable raceways. we now have two much smaller, easier to manage parts. They're a touch on the short side, but we can fix that. Let's put these wraps into place temporarily with some tape so that we can put some alignment lines in place. Note that this top wrap will align along the top edge 1/8 of an inch below the top of the tube. We put that line in place several episodes ago. Next, I'll put some tape in place to protect the surface of the tube while we sand the application areas to improve the adhesion of the wrap. With the protective tape in place, we can now roughen these areas with sandpaper. This is 150 grit paper. We'll use a tack cloth to get the sanding dust off of the part and off of our workbench. There's no need to sand the surface of the shroud base. We're ready to install these wraps. Now, my recommendation is to install the third stage wraps first. In other words, these two upper wraps. The reason for that is that when we're ready to install the shroud wrap, that will give us a positive location against which to apply that wrap. I've placed a couple of bits of tape on the outside of the lower third stage wrap. That will keep it from blowing around as we spray the adhesive in place. As before, we're using 3M Super 77 adhesive. Each stroke starts off the piece and finishes off the piece. We'll allow the solvent to flash off for about 4 minutes before we proceed. We need to make sure we get the orientation correct on this. These two details right here are reaction control systems that are at the base of the third stage of the Saturn V. The pointy end of those goes forward, so that is the direction we need to apply that. The two triangular bits that stick out from the wrap represent what are called ullage motors. Now, ullage is a brewing term, and it refers to the air inside of a keg of beer. The idea is that at the appropriate moment, these ullage motors fire and position all of the propellants at the aft end of the propellant tanks. We'll start the wrap installation at this reference line. Now we do have a bit of a gap here at this end. I'll show you in a bit how to repair that gap. I'll put a piece of tape in place to hold that down while the glue settles. Let's discuss the positioning of the upper wrap on our third stage. The corrugations are aft on the third stage, while the smooth area will be forward. Also, the forward edge of the wrap will be 1/8 of an inch aft of the leading edge of the airframe tube. We've placed a reference line there already. The other critical thing we need to do is to make sure that this top of the cable raceway lines up with the cable raceway detail at the lower end of the stage. If we start at the reference line, those two elements will line up. We've got some tape on the outside of the wrap to keep it in place. Again, we'll let the solvent flash off for a few minutes before going forward. I've redrawn the reference line on the third stage so that it shows up on camera a little bit better. Also, we should review the orientation of the wrap one more time. Again, the corrugations go aft, the smooth portion goes forward. bit of tape will hold everything in place while the glue sets up. The glue has cured on our third stage wraps and they look fantastic. Could not be more pleased there. There are some gaps. Gaps are easy to fix. We'll get into that in a bit here. Our next task will be to put the wrap on the adapter shroud. Now I recommend that you practice this many times before we even think about using glue. Note that there will be a gap again. Not a problem. Those are easy to fix. The adapter shroud has been taped face down with the adhesive side up. We'll let that cure for a few moments. The adhesive on our wrap has set up and we're ready to start working it into place. We'll start at the seam on the adapter, which is aligned with the reference line above. And as we roll it into place, we'll make sure it's just below the lower third stage wrap. My magnification may get in the way here. Sorry if that happens. And we end up right back where we started. There's a gap. Easy to fix. I'll put some tape in place and we'll let that cure. The adhesive on our wraps is cured and I'm really pleased with the results. There's a couple of things we still need to take care of. First, we need to replace these cable raceway details. There's one here and a shorter one here. And we also need to fill in the gaps here. Let's start with the gaps. All of the wrap parts on our Saturn V were created from 010 thick styrene sheets that were then formed into these shapes. We can use the scrap material from our styrene parts to create pieces of plastic that we can insert into these gaps. Sounds a little daunting at first, but it's actually very simple. I've got a sharp blade and I'm going to cut out a sliver of styrene and we're going to test the fit of that into our gaps. That one's a little wide, so is that one. That one's a little narrow actually. Let's try flipping it around. One thing you need to understand about these gaps is that they're vaguely wedge-shaped. Let's try another one. That's almost perfect. And this one is perfect. This fits perfectly. Now I've cut 3 pieces of scrap styrene that seem to fit really well into the 3 gaps. So what I'm going to do is fit the first one in here up at the top. Note that it's too long. We'll trim it off later. And then I'm going to put a little bit of Tamiya thin cement in there with it. And use the back edge of an X-Acto to work it down into the slot. The plastic will not only bond to the other plastic, it will also bond to the primer there. I'm then going to slice off the ends. And step 1 of the process for that gap is done. Let's work on the next 2. This does take a bit of trial and error, so patience is a virtue here. We've fitted the styrene strips into these 3 gaps and allowed the glue some time to stabilize. What we need to do now is clean these gaps up a little bit. Normally we'd use a sanding stick, but these are down inside the corrugations. So we're going to use a very tiny sanding stick. This is a medium and fine sanding stick that's designed to get down into little crevices like that. Doesn't take long at all. This plastic is so thin and shapes very quickly and easily. We'll use the fine side of this now. This is still missing something though. There's an obvious visual break in the corrugations on each of these wraps. How can we fix that? Well, we've got a great way to do that. This is half-round styrene strip. It's literally what it says. If you take 2 of these and glue them back to back, you'll have a styrene rod. It's not at all that dissimilar from the shapes of the corrugations on our model. It's a matter of finding the right-sized half-round piece and then fitting it to fill the gaps on our model. Now I've already done some homework on the sizing. The 040 half round will work well up here, while the 080 will be a perfect fit for the bottom wrap. We'll start with the lower adapter wrap. I've got a piece of the uncut styrene stock. Again, this is the 080 size. It's going to fit right in there. What we need to do is cut it to an appropriate length and shape the ends so that it looks more like the corrugations that are already in place. I've marked the strip. I'm going to cut it just a hair long. The reason I'm doing that is because we are going to do some sanding on it. Next, I'm going to nibble away at the corners until it looks more rounded. It doesn't take much. I am using magnification here. We'll then use a sanding stick to work on the profile. It is spooky how good that looks. We'll bring some thin cement in, just wick it under the part. Do a little bit at a time. I'll use the X-Acto to wiggle into place and provide some pressure on it. And then we'll work our way up the part. That just looks fantastic. I could not be more pleased with that. We'll be using 040 half-round stock on these upper sections. The only difference is we'll be using 2 in each gap instead of just 1. Definitely using magnification here. Same process as before. We'll nibble away a little at the end of each piece. And then we'll sand the end to get that rounded profile we need. I doubt this will show up on camera very well, even at 4K resolution. Let's fit these in place. That looks great. We'll do this next one off camera. Our next task will be to cut away the remainder of these 3 cable raceway details. I've got a fine point ballpoint pen, and I'm going to mark the circumference of each. Now with a fresh number 11 blade, I'll try to cut just to the inside of those marks. I'll clean up those edges with a sanding stick. Let's make some replacement parts for those cable raceways we just cut off. Now what I have here is a piece of scrap styrene from a previous project. This is 060 thickness. It's pretty beefy stuff. Roughly the height of the detail we excised from the third stage wrap. I've also verified that this corner is in fact square. We want to lay out two parts. The first one will be 100 millimeters. By 8 millimeters wide. I'm going to square up this triangle to extend the 8 millimeter line. And that is going to intersect with the 100 millimeter line. Next, we're going to score these marks. Remember, we don't need to cut all the way through. I'm going to cut all the way across the part to make it easier to snap. There's our first cut. I'm going to use the straight edge to help us out here on this long cut. And we should be able to snap that now. There's our part. We'll clean that up with a sanding stick. We also need to put a bevel in the leading edge. Our second part will be 36 millimeters long by 3 millimeters wide. Our parts are cut out. I'm going to use a sanding block to take the sharp edges off of each and then sand a bevel into each end of the long one. We're ready to attach our scratch-built cable raceways to the model. We're going to use 5-minute epoxy for that. Because they are dissimilar materials, that's one of my personal faves for that application. Now, just off camera, I have some rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip. That's there just in case there's any squeeze out of the epoxy from underneath the parts. I've already test fit this. I have a forward and aft mark on here. And I'm going to put just the finest line of epoxy down the length of this part. And we'll fit this into place, give it a wiggle, apply some pressure. There is some squeeze out. Easy to fix with our Q-tip. And I will just hold this for the next 5 minutes. The glue on our long raceway has set up, so we can go ahead and install the shorter one. I've already mixed up some epoxy. There's a little bit of squeeze out, so I'll use the rubbing alcohol on a Q-tip trick. And with that, this section of our model is complete. Before we end this episode, let's do a little bit of repair work on our main airframe tube. The Type 77 adhesive we use to apply these wraps is not the most tenacious stuff in the world. And the possibility, actually the likelihood, that some of the edges will peel up is extremely high. We've already seen it happen in some locations on this particular model. Repairing those is very easy to do, and I'm going to show you my favorite way to do that. There's a few things we'll need to do this particular repair. First, we'll need medium CA and CA accelerator. Now the CA accelerator, I prefer to decant into these little tiny squeeze bottles with a syringe tip. This enables me to place it with much greater precision and cleanliness. You also end up using a whole lot less CA and the bottle lasts a lot longer. I've also chopped up a whole bunch of paper slips. These are each about 2 inches long by about 3/8 of an inch wide. We're going to use these as tools to get the glue under the wraps. Let's demo the process real quick. The first thing I should state is that we only want to do a small section at a time. Don't try to do an entire end of a strip all at once. We're going to do a little section, then move on to the next section. Making a small puddle of CA onto an index card, taking one of my paper slips, picking up some of the CA on that paper slip, and I'm slipping that under the plastic piece we want to repair. Pull the paper out, hold it down, and then touch the accelerator to that spot. Hold it for a few minutes, and then we can move down the seam a bit and do the next one. I'll do the other side over here. Hold it down into place and hit it with a touch of the accelerator. Eventually I'll do that whole seam. Now let's take a look at these. These little boogers are especially problematic. We'll get a fresh puddle of CA, another paper strip, and put just a little bit underneath one corner. I'll even use the back edge of an X-Acto knife to hold that down and drop some CA accelerator in place and hold that for a moment. It's a good idea to wipe off any excess right away. And then we'll move to the next spot. That brings us to the end of this episode. In our next installment, we'll be trimming and mounting the fins and fin fairings. Thanks for watching.